One of the prices to be paid for extracting the raw materials of industry is the upheaval it causes to our landscape. Mining for coal has left us with unattractive heaps of colliery spoil. For every 2 tons of coal produced, there can be up to a ton of waste to be disposed of. Unless something's done about it, the waste remains to cast a blight on the surroundings. And for people who live in the vicinity, it's an unwelcome intrusion. The effects of agriculture may be less dramatic, but nevertheless, they are changing the face of our landscape. Take the popular beauty spot of the Yorkshire Dales. Here are some of the best examples of traditional hay meadows in England, but they're under threat from changes in farming practice. Some change is inevitable, but just as we should strive to preserve our most highly prized landscapes, so we should try to restore our derelict land to something more acceptable. The answer to both problems lies in effective land management, and that depends on a knowledge of ecology. To turn this barren waste tip into something more attractive presents an interesting set of problems. Professor Tony Bradshaw of Liverpool University explains what can be done.
Well, here's a splendid example. This colliery spoil heap comes from a mine over there, and it represents just the waste from getting at the coal, getting access to it. It's probably the biggest unreclaimed heap in Britain now, and it's really an extraordinary thing to leave lying around. This represents just a complete waste of land. And really we should be recycling this instead of just leaving it to lie waste.
We've got some vegetation growing here, haven't we? So this may do some revegetation.
Yes, very interesting. What we're looking at is 1 or 2 significant species. This thing here is Discampsia flexuosa, wavy hairgrass. Here is sheep sorrel, Rumex acetosella, and here is common bent grass, Agrostis tenuis or Agrostis capillaris. Now the interesting thing about all these is that they are all the most tolerant species you can find. They're very tolerant of poor acid conditions. And that really gives us a clue as to why this area is so empty of species on the whole.
So there's not very much of that anywhere else?
No, if we go up above, we'll see this.
Not much here to interest an ecologist?
Well, no, I agree with you. No plants, nothing. But yet, really, surely that should be the challenge for an ecologist. What is it? This heap has been here for about 40 years. And in that time, at least in this area we're in, nothing has come. It would be marvellous if we could actually create a productive, self-sustaining ecosystem on this sort of material, because it would not only get rid of the problem, but it would be a real test of our ecological understanding.
Well, how would you go about that?
Well, we've obviously got to try and understand what is stopping plant growth. Now, it's clearly going to be a matter of soil rather than anything else. If we analyse this soil, we find that the pH is ridiculously low, about 2.5, and if we then analyse for nutrients, we find that available nitrogen and phosphorus are very low, completely deficient, in fact.
And can we correct this?
Yes, that would be very easy. Here's a box experiment where we've done that. What we've done is to treat the acidity by adding lime, and we've got here high lime or no lime. And we're treating the lack of nutrients by adding either high fertiliser or no fertiliser. Now, which do you think is which?
Well, I would guess that that must have received the fertiliser and the lime, because it's growing quite well.
Yeah.
That presumably has only had the lime. It's growing fairly well. And one of these has had nothing, and one has just had fertiliser.
Yes, yes, that's absolutely right. The perfect result is with both lime and fertiliser. That's lime, and then, in fact, that has had fertiliser and is the worst one. This, which has had nothing, the plants are actually growing slowly.
Well, that tells us that we need lime and a source of nutrients. But it doesn't tell us how much of these we need, does it?
No, that's true. What we need is a large-scale experiment actually done in the field. This was done in the greenhouse. In this experiment, which we're setting up, we're going to look at the effect of just one nutrient, phosphorus. And what we've got is 6 levels ranging from 0 up to 160. And they're all arranged at random, and then they're repeated again in these other 2 replicas. Now, the interesting thing here is that in the box experiment, we only used ryegrass. But in this experiment, what we're going to sow is a mixture of grass species. Then we'll not only get the average effect of phosphorus on grasses, but also the responses of the individual grasses to the different phosphorus levels.
Are we restricted to grasses for this sort of restoration?
No, you're quite right. No, we're not. Because, in fact, when they first reclaimed these sort of heaps, they actually just planted trees on them. This enabled them to plant without doing any complicated earthworks and reshaping. This spoil heap was reclaimed about 1955. Now, that was an interesting time because it was when there was very little money for land reclamation. So all they did was to take the heap and plant trees with just a little bit of fertilizer directly on it. No other treatment at all. Now, this end has failed, I think probably because it was too acid. But look at that. We've got really the makings of an excellent woodland ecosystem. There's alder, and there's larch, and there's beech here, and there's sweet chestnut over the way. It requires very little management, if any, and it's a most attractive thing for the local residents. A lot of them come here.
And there is the possibility of getting some production from it.
Yes, right. They aren't growing perfectly because the soil isn't very good, but it's doing very well. Now, the interesting thing is that this site has something else to offer also. Look at this over there. You see, we've got heather growing. Now, you might say, very common. Well, it isn't common in this part of the world. It's come in from some distance, probably, taking advantage of the poor acid conditions. And then there are other species. Can you see there, we've got woodrush. There's tormentil. Now, this suggests a totally different endpoint for this sort of land, which is for nature conservation, wildlife, and amenity. Now, there's, of course, a third possible ecosystem that we can create on this sort of land, and that is to take the thing back to agriculture, where we'll get an economic return. I remember this site 10 years ago. It was an enormous colliery spoil heap, and now all that's left is just those few buildings. Now, to turn it over to agriculture, a lot has to be done. The first thing that's got to happen is to level it, so that was done. Then it had to be given a very heavy dressing of lime because of the acidity. After that, it had to be ripped to loosen it. Then given a very heavy dressing of phosphorus, over 200 kilograms per hectare, because the phosphorus is actually bound in the soil. Then it had to be given complete fertilizer and then cultivated and seeded. Now, the seeding itself is interesting because it isn't just a case of having grass there. It had to include a legume, in this case white clover, to fix nitrogen. And here you have the end product. It's not at all bad. In fact, it's jolly good. There are some problems, though. Firstly, the soil is really very hard and heavy. That's because the shale weathers to give you a lot of clay. And then secondly, there's no clover, well, at least not very much. Despite those problems, it's really very productive. The pasture is carrying about half as many cows to the acre as you would get on a normal undisturbed pasture. That's really the final judgment that one can make. Surely we've actually here reconstructed a fully functioning, self-sustained ecosystem.
The use of fertilizers to increase production of crops is an integral part of current farming practice. Here in the upland areas of the Dales, fertilisers are now used to provide better grazing and winter feed for livestock. Another change in farming methods is the move away from hay to silage making. The combined effects of these changes are far-reaching, because this is not a natural landscape. Its beauty is the product of a particular style of farming. If this goes, the walls and barns could fall into disrepair, and we would lose the blaze of colour from these meadows in June and July. To prevent this happening, we need to find out what makes these meadows flourish with such a large number of plants. Here's Dr. Roger Smith from the University of Newcastle.
Well, what have we got? Down in the bottom right-hand corner, the grasses, first of all, the sweet vernal grass.
Some tricetum, isn't there?
That's right, the meadow oat grass.
About 6 grass species here at least.
Yes, that's usually the minimum for this sort of sward. The herbs, well, have a look at the colourful ones first. The obvious yellow of the meadow buttercup. The other yellow one that you get, the annual hay rattle. The red clover stands out very well here.
Then the white, there's
the white flowers, the eyebright.
And the pignut over the far side there,
just a solitary specimen. Those that are not in flower at the moment, which will come later, include the vetches, members of the pea family.
Some of them are flowering now and setting seed. There'll be some flowering later.
Yes.
So, in order for these to maintain themselves over the years, do they have to flower and set seed, or are they going to propagate vegetatively?
Well, some of them will reproduce predominantly by vegetative means. Where you've got the creeping buttercup in here, that is predominantly a vegetative reproduction. But some have to set seed. They have no other means of persisting in the sward, and the hay rattle is a good example of that. If you cut this sward for hay or for silage before that has set seed, then it will disappear virtually from the sward next year. Its only chance of reappearing is from seed in the soil that came from the past years in the seed bank. Yes.
Yeah, so these really depend on being allowed to grow up, to set seed, and so we've got to get the animals off here and off onto the permanent pasture after that.
They'll be there now until the hay's cut, and then they'll be brought back in here to graze the aftermath.
You're seeing quite a change here, aren't we? There's much less in the way of herbs and more grasses.
It's very different indeed here. The grasses really do dominate. Ryegrass, meadow foxtail, the ordinary corner garden, rough-stalked meadow grass, all indicative of very high fertility just here. We're next to the barn. I wouldn't mind betting that what's happening is that the contents of the midden are simply washed out over the winter months and raised the fertility considerably. This is the way forward, of course, for agricultural progress.
Of course, the production you're getting here in terms of grass is far greater than you get on the rest of the meadow.
3 times greater, generally speaking. Of course, a lot depends on the weather, but 3 times due according to the fertility. And a difference entirely in just what the sward looks like. The buttercups have virtually gone just here.
Yeah, so in fact the grasses have completely swamped the buttercups and the other herbs.
Very much so. Competition, that's the name of the game, really. It's not that the fertiliser has poisoned anything, it's just that the grasses have grown so vigorously that they've outcompeted everything else. Well, if we're going to manage these grasslands as nature reserves, we're going to have to maintain the diversity of the sward. That's going to be the objective after all. And in ecological terms, it means thinking about 3 things: the overall fertility of the sward, the variation that you get in soil conditions, and the variation in time, some plants flowering early, some plants flowering late, and when the sward's actually cut. The moderately low fertility here, you see, it means you get a very large number of species, as I said, we said before, up to 30, 35 even in this particular field, plants in a square metre. And the moderately low fertility maintains it, so no competitors take over. You've also got the other factor that there are dung patches and urine patches, which create different levels of fertility in different spots, encouraging a wide variation in plants within a small area as well.
And the cutting also means that you remove the species which would otherwise overtop some of the
At hay
lower growing
time,
ones.
yes, at hay time, the dominant species just get cut off at the ankles, in a sense, and the others can therefore persist in the sward.
Is there any way we can artificially manage this, or do we have to go to the original farm management?
Well, I think what we have to do is, in the absence of more detailed scientific experimentation, we've got to go back to traditional management, to generally moderate levels of muck, to winter grazing, and to hay cutting rather than silage.
The traditional pattern of farming dates back to Tudor times and has changed surprisingly little over the years. In between periods of grazing, the fields were allowed to grow up for hay. Before mechanisation, the hay was cut using scythes. A lot of labour was involved, and everything depended on a period of fine weather for the hay to dry before it could be stored in the barn.